A man tried to escape the Civil War by moving his family 120 miles away. It didn't work. 620,000 Americans died in 4 years of fighting, and the conflict that began in this man's backyard was about to end in his parlor. His name was Wilmer McLean. On April 9, 1865, the war knocked on his door one last time to ask for a seat in his living room. But what happened inside wasn't the clean, heroic myth you were taught in school. It was awkward, it was messy, and it involved a stolen rag doll that would become a silent witness to the birth of a reunited nation. By April 1865, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was a ghost. They were starving, eating parched corn and raw meat when they could find it. Lee was trying to reach a supply train, but everywhere he turned, he saw blue. On the morning of April 9th, Lee looked at his maps and realized the exit was blocked. His men were being slaughtered. He turned to his officers and said the words that would haunt him. "There is nothing left me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths."
He didn't just send a letter. He sent a messenger with a white flag. But here's a detail many people miss. The flag of truce wasn't a flag at all. It was a common, dirty white dish towel. Lee prepared for the meeting like it was his own funeral. He put on his finest dress uniform, spotless gray, a silk sash, and a gold-handled sword. He was the picture of old-world aristocracy. Grant, on the other hand, he didn't have time to change. He arrived late, mud-splattered, wearing a common soldier's blouse with only his shoulder straps to show his rank. When they finally sat down in McLean's parlor, the silence was deafening. Lee was 58, silver-haired and regal. Grant was 42, stooped and rough-hewn. What do you say to the man you've been trying to kill for 3 years? Grant, surprisingly, started with small talk. He reminded Lee that they had met once before, 20 years earlier, during the Mexican-American War. Grant remembered Lee vividly. Lee, however, admitted he couldn't remember what Grant looked like back then. It was an awkward, human moment.
Grant later wrote that he felt sad and depressed at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. He actually got so carried away chatting about the old days that Lee had to be the one to steer the conversation back to the surrender. Now, look closely at the men standing behind Grant. One man usually gets cropped out of the history books, but he was the most important person in the room. His name was Ely Parker. Parker was a Seneca chief and a trained lawyer. Because of his beautiful penmanship and legal mind, Grant asked him to draft the official surrender documents. When Lee saw Parker, he froze. He reportedly stared at Parker's features, mistaking him for a black man, and was visibly taken aback. When Lee realized Parker was a Native American, he extended his hand and said, "I am glad to see one real American here." Parker shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and replied, "We are all Americans, sir." That one moment changed the way Lee saw the men he was surrendering to. That document, the one that effectively ended the war, wasn't written by a white politician. It was penned by a Seneca chief in a Virginia parlor. Everyone expected Grant to be vengeful. People in the North were calling for Lee to be hanged for treason. But Grant's terms were shockingly generous. First, the Confederate soldiers wouldn't be taken as prisoners. They were paroled, meaning they could go home as long as they promised not to fight again. Second, Lee mentioned his men owned their own horses and mules. Grant, a farm boy at heart, knew the planting season was starting. He told Lee to let the men take their animals home, to put in a crop to carry themselves and their families through the next winter. Third, when Lee mentioned his men were starving, Grant immediately ordered 25,000 rations to be sent to the Confederate camp. This wasn't a conquest. It was a reconciliation. But as soon as the ink was dry, and Lee stepped out onto the porch, the gentlemanly atmosphere evaporated. The Union officers in the room went into a souvenir craze. They started stripping Wilmer McLean's house bare. General Sheridan paid $20 for the table Grant used, then gave it to a young officer named George Custer to carry away. Another officer took the chair Lee sat in. But the most heartbreaking souvenir was the silent witness. Wilmer's 7-year-old daughter, Lula, had left her favorite rag doll on the sofa. As the generals left, Union officers began tossing the doll around the room, jokingly calling it the silent witness to the surrender. Captain Thomas Moore eventually stuffed the doll in his pocket and took it home. It would be 127 years before that doll was finally returned to Appomattox.
As Lee rode away on his horse, Traveler, his men broke into tears. He told them, "Boys, I have done the best I could for you. Go home now." Most people think the war ended that day. It didn't. There were still 175,000 Confederate troops in the field. The last land battle wouldn't happen for another month, and the last Confederate ship wouldn't surrender until November, in England. But Appomattox set the tone. When the Union troops started to cheer and fire cannons in celebration, Grant immediately stopped them. He said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." What if Grant had taken the terms the North was demanding? Lee tried for treason, his officers imprisoned, his men stripped of their horses and marched to prison camps. The South occupied not as a territory to be reintegrated, but as a conquered enemy to be punished. The reconciliation that Appomattox made possible, however imperfect, however incomplete, would have been replaced by something that looked far more like occupation. The wounds that took generations to partially close might never have closed at all. Grant's generosity was not weakness. It was the most strategically consequential decision of the entire war. Wilmer McLean eventually sold his house and moved away, complaining that the war had ruined him. But he left behind a legacy that defines America to this day. In a small room filled with stolen furniture and a discarded doll, two men decided that it was better to be one country than a graveyard of two. This story reminds us that the hardest thing in any conflict is not winning. Winning is just persistence and firepower. The hardest thing is deciding what kind of victor you want to be, and having the character to choose reconciliation when revenge is sitting right there on the table. Lee walked into that parlor expecting humiliation. He walked out with his sword, his dignity, and enough food to feed his starving army. Remember, the character of a nation is not measured in how it fights its enemies. It is measured in what it offers them when the fighting stops. If you want more stories like this, the ones that change how you see history, subscribe and hit the bell. We will see you in the next one.